Do you have any plans whatsoever to step into the Conservative leadership race if there is a race now or sometime in the next 4 years?
No, I have my hands full. I love being premier of this province. We're going to build this province, and I'm going to continue leading this province. That's my job.
Even before a leadership review, other Conservative politicians like Doug Ford are being asked hypotheticals like, would you consider running for leader? And that's because Erin O'Toole's days as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada could be numbered. At least 35 Conservative MPs have signed a letter calling for a vote on his leadership. That's enough to trigger a vote by the entire caucus. O'Toole has been under fire from some within the party for failing to deliver more seats in the GTA in the last election. He's also been criticized for policy flip-flops.
Caucus is set to meet tomorrow when O'Toole could face a vote. For more on this political turmoil, we're joined live tonight by Tom Mulcair, former leader of the federal NDP, Scott Reid, CTV News political commentator, and Conservative strategist Jamie Ellerton. Good to have all of you on the show tonight. Thanks so much for being with us. Scott, there is so much to talk about. Let's begin by talking about the Premier of Ontario, who we just heard from, saying no thanks. My hands are full leading this province, that he has no interest in entering a potential Conservative Party leadership race. Do you believe him?
It seemed like, pardon me, sorry, but it did seem like a pretty definitive answer. He didn't leave a lot of room open to reverse himself. It sounded like he decided he's got an election in June. That's the first job that he has to take care of. So I'll be surprised if he reverses himself, but I wouldn't be surprised to see some draft. I mean, you know, Ford Nation's a pretty robust Conservative brand right now in this country. And, you know, Doug Ford, I think, has always kind of had high office aspirations, even higher than Premier. So I'm not surprised that he got the question. I'm not surprised at his answer, but I would be surprised if people didn't pose it to him again and maybe even he gets some courting.
Jamie, what are you hearing on the infighting within the Conservatives? What is it about Erin O'Toole that some MPs are unhappy with?
Yeah, frankly, Reshmi, I think the kind of coalition of Conservatives that are now coming forward are across kind of the factions of the party that get talked about quite regularly in the media and even internally. People are kind of really just dissatisfied with what Erin O'Toole has done, or more accurately, hasn't done. I know people who were supporters of his last leadership campaign who have kind of been scratching their heads. He just can never seem to get outside of the polemic debates that are forced upon him. He can never kind of redefine the conversation. And he's done really little to kind of inspire confidence that he's got a plan to kind of turn things around going forward towards the next election. And so I think when you look at kind of some who are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and chance to turn things around after the last election completed 4.5 months ago at the end of September, they're now left scratching their heads, can't figure out what Erin O'Toole's doing. A lot of people will point to specific issues and stuff that he's flip-flopped for, and I think that definitely undermines his credibility. But I think more importantly is I think he's just now viewed as tainted goods, and I don't think he can recover from that.
Tom, interested in getting your take. You know, so much chatter within the party, months of infighting, as Reshmi just talked about. Can Erin O'Toole survive this? Is it over for him?
I think that the numbers are simply not there for him tomorrow. But even if he were to survive by a couple of votes, I think he'd be mortally wounded. It would be very hard for him to keep going. And almost everybody seems to have something on the list of dealing with Erin O'Toole that they don't like. And it's very tough to watch because I've been through something similar, and I know how tough this is on the individual and on their family. But at the same time, you look at that list, and people, for example, felt that a trick had been played on them in the House of Commons on conversion therapy. I think conversion therapy is abysmal, and they did the right thing by agreeing with the Liberals to get rid of it. But there are members of that caucus who feel really badly that they weren't consulted. Everything from the carbon tax, which I also think is a good idea, but that is opposed by key members of the caucus. It's a question of whether you bring people along. At the beginning, Mr. O'Toole presented himself as the true blue Conservative, really somebody in the same vein as Stephen Harper. And then, as the campaign started, he described himself as a progressive Conservative, much more in line with Peter MacKay, who was somebody that he was deriding during the campaign as being far too soft. So people were wondering which Erin O'Toole was their leader. And at this stage, I think it's going to be very tough for him to continue.
So, Scott, who could it be then? He did beat Peter MacKay in that leadership. It was just 18 months ago Erin O'Toole's been on the job. Leslyn Lewis, Derek Sloan, who Erin O'Toole pointed out on Twitter last night. Who do you think it could be, Scott?
Well, there's a couple questions. One is who? I'll throw out another question. What? What are they going to be about? I mean, I think if we take a look at the trucker protest this weekend and the way that some prominent conservatives, including some who I'm about to mention as leadership candidates, you know, in the way in which they welcomed that movement without really any sense of caution or discretion, saying, you know what, we're going to welcome this. We're going to invite these people in. And then, of course, they saw themselves associated with all sorts of abuses and awful demonstrations, swastikas, and people defacing cenotaph and so on and so forth. And so I think, you know, the Conservative Party has to decide, what is it going to stand for? Is it going to be the party that sort of, you know, peddles people's grievances back at them, that just rides an ugly kind of populism, a sort of, you know, Donald Trump light? Is that what they want to be? Because they'll harden up 25% of the country and have them behind them forever. But they're going to have a hell of a time getting beyond that. So I think, you know, people like Pierre Poilievre, very talented communicator, capable politician, very much in that stream of things, very much say, let's whip them up. Let's take a bucket full of anger and throw it right back at people and see if we can get elected that way. I think they got a lot of danger if they choose that path. But it looks to me like that's where they're headed.
And some people talking about Michelle Rempel as well, a Calgary politician. Okay, Tom, I want to get your thoughts on Erin O'Toole's response. He said late last night that he's not going anywhere and that he is not turning back, adding there are two roads open to the Conservative Party of Canada. I'll read part of his statement to you right now. He goes on to say, one is the road of Randy Hillier and Derek Sloan. It's angry, negative, and extreme. It's a dead end, one that would see the Party of Confederation become the NDP of the right. What do you make of this response? And would you be surprised if Erin O'Toole resigns ahead of tomorrow's vote?
I'd be surprised if he resigns. I know him personally, and he's a tough cookie. He's not the type to simply walk away from it. But I think that was a communications mistake by Erin O'Toole, to talk about Derek Sloan and Randy Hillier essentially tarring the people who are opposed to you with the same brush, because those are two very extreme people. And I don't think that's a fair comparison. And there might have been people who were fence sitters who would have taken offense at something like that. And we tend to forget, talking about O'Toole's personal capabilities, he's a darn good politician. I mean, everybody last summer was convinced that Trudeau was going to win his majority in a romp. O'Toole held him to a minority, and were it not for the bad performance of Alberta on the pandemic that stuck to O'Toole, he could very well have won a minority himself. But we also forget that Scheer won more votes than Trudeau in the 2019 campaign. So the Conservatives are going to have to figure this one out. Because if you've got strong people who are good politicians, who get decent performances, but who can't satisfy everybody in this amalgam of the former Reform Party and the former Progressive Conservative Party, they're not the same thing. Harper held it together. Both Scheer and O'Toole have not been able to. Does that person exist? I don't believe that it's Pierre Poilievre. It's going to be interesting to see who goes in the interim. Will they finally reach out to somebody from Quebec and hope to build things up there? There's a really strong character named Gérald Deltel, who used to head up a political party in Quebec that actually became part of François Legault's coalition. So we'll see if they reach out beyond that, if they do indeed wind up replacing O'Toole tomorrow, which to me seems more and more likely.
This divide that we're describing here, it was during the Harper era as well, right, Jamie? There's that younger conservative support that is pro-LGBTQ, that is pro-environment, that is looking for a leader who is accepting and inclusive. And it sounds like the pushback on Erin O'Toole, correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, is that he is pro-LGBTQ, that he is trying to be more socially conscious than what these other people are looking for.
Yeah, Rashmi, I think this is actually part of where our political opponents, the opponents of the Conservative Party, are actually effective in kind of playing into some of the traditional fault lines within the party. I think if you look at where Canadian society was, Scott Reid is young enough to remember when the vast majority of the Jean Chrétien caucus, of which his former boss Paul Martin was a member of, voted overwhelmingly en masse, and I think it was 1999 against same-sex marriage. You then had courts legalize it in the early 2000s to then have Prime Minister Paul Martin legalize it federally across the land in 2005, late that spring. So the society's come a long way, and so I think you cannot kind of look where the politics of this were. Now you're nearly 20 years ago. The party has moved on, and a lot of society has moved on to be more socially accepting of this. And this is not, I think, something that kind of plays out the way that people talk about this in terms of the polemic debates. And I think if you look at kind of going back to my very first point, this is where Erin O'Toole has actually failed to show a new way that grows the party base, speaks to what unites Canadians, and will help keep the Conservative caucus, united. If you want to talk about social conservative issues, like I'm no SoCon, everyone knows that. But you could look at issues of what SoCons ultimately care about when you stop talking about abortion, and it's support for the family, strong institutions, and strong communities. And you can find issues and ways to advance those causes without getting into the polemic debates. But our politics continues to be politics as usual, and you haven't seen any kind of real leadership to turn the page on some of these generational issues that, quite frankly, are settled that some people just won't move beyond. And so I think when you look at kind of where Erin O'Toole is tonight, going into that vote tomorrow, I think the situation is untenable. He might mathematically have a chance in the same way like a baseball team 8 games back with 10 games left to play isn't mathematically eliminated. But by all accounts, he appears to be done. And so I think the question going forward for the party is how can the Conservative Party redefine the debate while relying on its core principles to address the challenges Canada faces today, as opposed to just being engaged in this vitriolic kind of negative anger fermenting culture that you increasingly see online and are seeing some of the more ugly sides of it rear its head with this trucker protests and actually unite Canadians to present an alternative. Erin O'Toole has been opposed to pretty much everything Justin Trudeau's done on a day-to-day basis when you listen to him in the media cycle. I don't think people can name 3 things that Erin O'Toole actually stands for unless they're talking about some of his flip-flops. And I think a new leader is going to have to address some of these challenges and kind of have a real honest conversation of not just running up past membership lists and seeing who can eke out a victory on a technicality, which is kind of how the past 2 leadership races have been, but actually to put some bold ideas on the table that redefines the conversation and gets people to address the challenges of today. Because if the Conservative Party is going to be looking backwards and continue trying to rehash old debates, the Conservative Party is going to be in opposition for a long time to come.
Yeah, so much to consider. We're running out of time here, but very quickly, Tom, I want to ask you, I wonder if you can give us a sense of how challenging this might be for Erin O'Toole as a leader to look around and hear some of that chatter, to see your MPs turning against you, and then to have to ask yourself, is it time to move on? Am I hurting the party by staying on?
It's very tough, and these are ideologically driven parties. The Conservatives are ideologically driven, and by definition, the ones who won their ridings when they don't form government are the ones that are in the safest Conservative ridings. So they're on an easy perch. They can just look around and say, all you got to do is be more right-wing, be more like me, be more like my riding. And O'Toole's answer has been, I want to reach out. I want to win government, and we cannot do that just by being in an echo chamber with ourselves. We'll find out which of those visions prevails. I am quite concerned for Mr. O'Toole. I don't think he's going to have the numbers tomorrow.
What a week ahead. Tom Mulcair, Jamie Ellerton, and Scott Reed. Thank you all so much for making time tonight.
Thanks so much.
All the best.
Good night, everyone.